Israel has launched a major attack on Iran, and this could escalate into a larger war. However, the United States is not just sitting on the side watching what is happening. The Donald Trump administration is directly involved. Mere hours after Israel attacked Iran, Trump told the New York Post that he knew about the attack beforehand. Trump said, quote, "I always knew the date because I know everything," end quote. And then he threatened Iran and said that he gave 60 days for Iran to agree to the very aggressive terms demanded by Washington. Iran refused. So on day 61, Israel attacked Iran with the support of the United States. Trump has repeated these comments in interviews with many different media outlets. Trump told Reuters that his top administration officials knew about the Israeli attack. They were in constant communication with Israel. He said, quote, "We knew everything," end quote. Trump told the Wall Street Journal exactly the same thing. And in an interview with ABC News, Trump made it clear that Israel carried out this attack in close coordination with the United States. Trump praised the attack and said, quote, "I think it has been excellent," end quote. And then he threatened Iran again and said, quote, "We gave them a chance and they didn't take it. They got hit hard, very hard, and there's more to come, a lot more," end quote. So the US is planning more attacks on Iran using Israel to wage this war. In fact, the Wall Street Journal admitted the Trump administration carried out a very cynical strategy in which Trump claimed to Iran that he wanted peace talks. But this was actually all part of a scheme to attack Iran when Iran was not expecting it. The Wall Street Journal noted that the Trump administration told Iran it would partake in the 6th round of negotiations in Oman on the 15th of June. But in reality, despite all of these talks going on for over 5 rounds, the Trump administration was preparing to attack Iran using Israel. As the Wall Street Journal put it, it all, quote, ended up being the perfect cover for a surprise Israeli attack, end quote. In other words, the US government never wanted peace. The Trump administration's so-called peace talks in Iran were actually an elaborate ruse and illusion to prepare for a secret war on Iran. And this was also admitted by Israeli officials. This is how the Israeli media described this cynical strategy. Quote, "The US participated in a massive campaign to lull Iran into thinking an attack was not going to happen immediately," end quote. Trump went out in the media and he said that he does not want Israel to attack Iran. He said that he wanted peace, but it was all a lie. The US actually wanted war, and behind the scenes, the US was planning the war. In fact, ABC News interviewed Trump administration officials who admitted that they were giving intelligence to Israel to help it carry out these attacks on Iran. So again, the US didn't just support what Israel was doing. The US was directly involved. As ABC News put it, citing Trump administration officials, the US provided exquisite intel. The US had advance notice of the strikes, and US officials said that the Israeli strikes will continue to be very intense over several days. The media outlet Axios, which is very close to the Israeli government, published an article that reveals the details of this cynical strategy. It notes that 2 Israeli officials said that Trump and his aides were only pretending to oppose an Israeli attack in public. In reality, an Israeli official said, quote, "We had a clear US green light," end quote. Axios continued saying the goal was to convince Iran that no attack was imminent and make sure Iranians on Israel's target list would not move to new locations. And in fact, this article also revealed how the US and Israel were manipulating the Western media, because a few days before Israel attacked Iran, the Trump administration and media outlets in Israel claimed that Trump had a phone call with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and supposedly Trump was pressuring Netanyahu not to attack Iran, according to Western media reports. But in reality, Axios admits, citing Israeli officials, that this was all part of an elaborate scheme, that they actually had lied to the Western media And in reality, when Trump called Netanyahu a few days before the attack, Trump was giving his final green light. And by the way, after Iran responded to Israel's unilateral attack, Iran hit back in self-defense, and the US military was directly involved in intercepting and shooting down some of the Iranian missiles that were heading toward Israel. So not only did the Trump administration help Israel carry out the attack and give it intelligence and give it a green light and help to plan the operation, but then after, the US military directly got involved to protect Israel. So everything that happened was a joint US-Israeli operation. Israel was not acting alone, and Israel is not dragging the US into the war. The US approved this war. This was a personal decision made by Donald Trump himself to attack Iran. This means that when US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio claimed that, quote, "we are not involved in strikes against Iran," end quote, that is a lie. That is completely false. So yeah, the US military didn't directly carry out these strikes, but the US gave Israel the ammunition, the missiles, the planes, and intelligence. The US government was involved in planning this operation. It knew about it for months, and Trump personally gave Israel the green light to carry out this attack on Iran, which is an aggressive act of war. Israel does not make significant military and foreign policy decisions without the approval of the United States. Israel is an extension of the US empire in one of the most strategic regions of the world. The former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig referred to Israel as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. And in fact, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the exact same thing. He said that Israel is a, quote, "mighty aircraft carrier," end quote, of the US empire. In fact, Netanyahu himself is an American. Netanyahu was raised in the US. English is his main language. He went to high school and college and got his first job in the US. Netanyahu was a US citizen, not just once, but twice. So Netanyahu was a US citizen. He gave it up in order to become the Israeli ambassador. And then he got US citizenship again, and he gave it up a second time in order to become Israel's prime minister. But he is an American. Netanyahu has been a longtime friend of especially Republicans. He is a Republican, and he's been a friend of Donald Trump for decades. And under Netanyahu, and also under other Israeli leaders, the Israeli regime does not make important decisions without first getting the green light from the United States, because it's the United States that arms and protects Israel. The US gives Israel billions of dollars of military aid every year, weapons, ammunition, missiles, planes. Israel could not wage its war on Iran and Gaza and Lebanon and Syria without the support of the US. It would be impossible. Top Israeli military officials have repeatedly admitted this in interviews in the media, saying that if the US withdrew support for their wars would have to end. So all of these wars are not just Israeli wars. They are joint US-Israeli wars. And don't forget, the US also protects Israel and prevents any international institution from taking action against Israel over its war crimes and crimes against humanity. So for instance, the Trump administration this June just vetoed a resolution in the UN Security Council that called for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The US was the only country in the UN Security Council that opposed the resolution, but the US has veto power. And this was the 5th time since 2023 that the US government has vetoed a ceasefire resolution in the UN Security Council on behalf of Israel. The Biden administration did it 4 times, and the Trump administration, just 4 months into office, has already vetoed another UN Security Council resolution. Moreover, the International Criminal Court at The Hague has issued an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But he's not going to be arrested because the ICC is afraid of the United States, because the US is protecting Netanyahu. So this is a war criminal, a literal war criminal, who has been charged by the International Criminal Court of crimes against humanity and war crimes in Gaza. And yet, immediately after Trump returned to the White House, he imposed sanctions on the ICC. And now the US media has admitted that the ICC is unable to continue carrying out its investigations because of the US sanctions. So the US is blatantly violating international law, spitting in the face of the international law-based order, and protecting war criminals and crimes against humanity. And in fact, Donald Trump is proud of this. He took to his Twitter copy website, which is called Truth Social, and on the 13th of June, right after Israel attacked Iran with US support, he boasted about the role of the US. He said, quote, "The United States makes the best and most lethal military equipment anywhere in the world by far, and Israel has a lot of it, with much more to come," end quote. So Trump is boasting that the US has given tens of billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition to Israel, and Israel is using that to attack Iran. And then Trump gloated about Israel killing top Iranian officials. Trump said, quote, "They are all dead now," in all caps. He said, "and it will only get worse," end quote. And then later in this tweet or post or whatever, Trump referred to it proudly as a slaughter. He referred to the attack that he's sponsoring against Iran as slaughter, and he said that they already are planning new attacks that will be, quote, "even more brutal," end quote. So he's admitting that the US and Israel are carrying out a slaughter and brutal attacks and killing top Iranian officials. These are all acts of war. The United States is waging war against Iran. And yet there are still some people, Trump supporters, who claim that Trump wants peace and it's all Netanyahu and Israel that are forcing the US to get involved in war. They claim falsely that the tail wags the dog. No, Israel is an outpost for the US empire in one of the most geostrategic regions on earth, right in the heart of West Asia, the Middle East. And everything that Israel does, all of its big decisions, are only done so under the protection of the US, with a green light and the approval of the US. And Donald Trump has made that as clear as day. In fact, an hour and a half after that previous post on the 13th of June, Trump published another post on Truth Social in which he said that he gave Iran an ultimatum of 60 days to make a deal. That is, to surrender to the US and to do what the US orders Iran to do. But Iran refused to give up its sovereignty. And what was the response? Trump said today is day 61. That was the 13th of June was day 61. So the US told Israel to attack Iran. Trump said, quote, "I told them what to do, but they just couldn't get there," end quote. He added, quote, "They should have done it," end quote. This is how Trump treats foreign countries. He does not believe in sovereignty. If another country doesn't do what the US empire orders it to do, Trump says attack it, bomb it, destroy it. That's what the US is doing to Iran. And Trump acts as though Iran is completely irrational and aggressive. But why would Iran sign an agreement with the US? Because Iran previously did that a decade ago in 2015. And what happened? Donald Trump tore up the previous agreement. And during his first term as president in 2018, he came into office and he destroyed unilaterally, he destroyed an international agreement. This was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. And not only was it signed by Iran and the United States, at that time under the Barack Obama administration, but it was also signed and brokered by the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, including Russia, China, the UK, and France. Those together are referred to as the P5 plus one, which was Germany, and the European Union. All of these countries and the EU signed the JCPOA, and then it was written into international law with a UN resolution that was approved by the UN Security Council, including approved by the US government. But then Trump came in, he tore up the agreement, and he imposed illegal unilateral sanctions on Iran, with the goal of destroying Iran's economy. He proudly referred to it as the maximum pressure strategy to suffocate the Iranian economy. So why would Iran make another agreement with the US government, and especially with Donald Trump, after he was the one who violated the previous agreement, and then he demanded even more harsh, ridiculous terms that no independent sovereign country would agree to? And this is especially the case after what the US did to Libya, because Libya previously had an anti-colonial revolutionary president, Muammar Gaddafi, who overthrew a US-backed Western dictator, a Western monarchy. And then what happened? The US led a war, a NATO war in 2011 that overthrew the Libyan government and killed Gaddafi. And why was it able to do that? Because Gaddafi gave up the pursuit of nuclear weapons. Previously, Libya had a nuclear program, but Libya made an agreement with the US and the European powers to give up its nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. The West lifted some of the sanctions on Libya. And then what happened? Just a few years later, the US, France, Canada, the UK, and NATO waged a war to overthrow the Libyan government and kill Gaddafi. So why would any country looking at that, why would they do the exact same thing that Libya did? This is what the US wants Iran to do. This is why North Korea, the DPRK, will not give up its nuclear weapons. Because as soon as it gives up its nukes, the US will wage war to overthrow the North Korean government, period. That's what the US did to Libya. It's also what the US did to Iraq. You know, the Bush administration falsely claimed that Iraq had so-called weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. We know that was a lie that was spread by the CIA, laundered through the corporate media in the West, and so-called journalists who were spreading lies on behalf of the US government. If Iraq actually had WMDs, if it actually had nuclear weapons, the US would not have invaded. That's why the US has not invaded North Korea. Because, again, they learned what happened in Libya, and Iran learned what happened in Libya. And the irony of all of this is now it makes it even more likely that Iran will pursue nuclear weapons. Because, by the way, Iran does not currently have nuclear weapons. There is only one country in West Asia, the Middle East, that has nuclear weapons. And you know what that country is? It's Israel. Israel refuses to join the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So Israel's possession of nuclear weapons violate international law. Moreover, Israel does not accept the safeguards of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And experts say that Israel has at least 90 plutonium-based nuclear warheads and has produced enough plutonium for 100 to 200 weapons. So Israel potentially has hundreds of nuclear weapons, at least 90 in the most conservative estimate. Iran has 0, and yet the US and Israel are, of course, demanding that Iran never get nuclear weapons because they use Israel to threaten all of the countries in the region, so they obediently do whatever the United States tells them to do. And by the way, there are frequently votes in the UN General Assembly demanding that the Middle East, that West Asia, be a nuclear-free zone, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons in the region. And every single time this vote comes up, Israel votes against it, voting against the entire world. And usually, the United States also votes against these resolutions protecting Israel. The US, the UK, and Canada, the gang of colonial Anglo countries, they always protect Israel and prevent any international actions from being taken against Israel, which is blatantly violating international law on a daily basis. By the way, on the subject of nuclear weapons, did you know that the apartheid regime in South Africa offered to sell nuclear weapons to Israel back in the 1970s? Because apartheid South Africa and Israel were very close allies. And it makes sense because they have very similar systems. The apartheid regime in South Africa was a racist, white supremacist, colonialist regime created by European colonialists. And Israel is also a racist, ethno-supremacist apartheid regime, a settler colonial regime created by Western colonialists, European colonialists. So the apartheid regime in Israel is very similar to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And today we can see many historical parallels. The extreme crimes committed by the apartheid regime in South Africa are very similar to the crimes committed by the Israeli regime against the indigenous Palestinian people who have been living under an illegal Israeli military occupation in violation of international law for decades. And today, the same Western imperialist powers that colonized most of the world continue to staunchly support Israel and to make possible its crimes against the indigenous Palestinian people. You can see a clear example of this in the outrageous statements made by European governments in response to Israel's attack on Iran, which was a unilateral war of aggression sponsored by the US. The Foreign Office of Germany published a statement saying, quote, "We strongly condemn the indiscriminate Iranian attack on Israeli territory." So Israel started this. Israel launched a war of aggression by attacking Iran first, and the response of the German regime that committed some of the worst atrocities in human history, the German regime responded by condemning Iran because Iran hit back in self-defense. So essentially what Germany is saying is that Iran is not allowed to defend itself, that Western colonial powers should be allowed to attack Iran and any other country they want, because these Western regimes never actually abandoned colonialism. They were forced out of their colonies through the revolutionary national liberation struggles in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They were defeated, but they still want to be colonial powers. They are desperate to recolonize all of these regions of the world, and that's what Israel is doing today. It's colonizing Palestine on behalf of the US empire and its European colonial allies, and they will not tolerate people in the region defending themselves against Western colonialism. That's why they condemn Iran for defending itself after the US and Israel attacked it first. France's multimillionaire banker president, Emmanuel Macron, did the exact same thing. By the way, in France, Macron is often referred to as the president of the rich because all he does is represent the interests of oligarchs, of billionaires and multimillionaires like him. Again, he was a former banker. And in response to Israel's attack on Iran, France and Macron condemned Iran, just like the German regime. And then immediately after, Macron said, quote, "France reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself and ensure its security," end quote. What about Iran? Iran has a right to defend itself and ensure its security. Iran is the country that was attacked in the first place. In fact, the US-sponsored Israeli attack on Iran killed 78 people and injured 320 more. And not everyone killed and injured by Israel was a military target. There were also many civilians who were killed and injured in this Israeli attack. One of the victims was a 25-year-old woman, Parnia Abbasi, who was a poet and an English teacher. And she was killed in Israel's US-sponsored act of war in an attack on residential areas in Iran. Why are the US and Israel killing Iranian civilians? What did this 25-year-old woman in Iran do to the US and Israel? Nothing. These are the civilian victims of US-sponsored crimes against humanity who are never shown in the Western media. Instead, only the US and Israel are allowed to be victims. And everyone who's not white, everyone who's not living in the West and the global North is portrayed as a villain. Anytime the US and Israel kill civilians in West Asia, the so-called Middle East, every single time, supporters of the US and Israel claim, oh, that's because these civilians were being used as so-called human shields by the barbarians, the colonized barbarians that we have to civilize through our Western colonial wars. That's always the racist, condescending talking point that is used by these imperialist propagandists in the West. But you know who actually uses human shields? The Israeli regime. This was admitted by Israel's top newspaper, Haaretz. It admitted that the headquarters of the IDF, the Israeli military, is based in the heart of Tel Aviv. the major city in Israel. This Israeli newspaper interviewed an Israeli expert in international law who admitted that there are, quote, concerns about severe damage to civilians should a target located in the heart of a densely populated civilian area be attacked, end quote. So why is Israel using its population as human shields? Why did the Israeli regime put the headquarters of its military in the heart of the major city, Tel Aviv? And if you don't believe that source, which is an Israeli media outlet, well, the New York Times admitted the same thing. In an article in 2021, the New York Times did a propaganda puff piece titled, "A Look Inside Israel's Fortress of Zion, Military Command Beneath Tel Aviv." In this article, the New York Times described a, quote, Israeli army command post deep underground beneath its headquarters in the heart of Tel Aviv, end quote. So this is why when Iran responds to Israel's act of war and Iran hits back in self-defense and Iran targets military sites in Israel, the Western media and Western regimes claim that supposedly Iran is targeting civilians. But no, Israel is objectively speaking using its population as human shields because Israel built its military headquarters in the middle of Tel Aviv. So how is Iran supposed to hit back without hurting civilians? It's impossible because Israel did this on purpose, because Israel knew that if it were ever hit, if any country like Iran were able to actually act in self-defense and fight back, it would be inevitable that there would be some civilian casualties because Israel is using its people as actual human shields. And by the way, when I say that Israel is using people as human shields, I'm not just speaking figuratively. I mean that literally. This was admitted by former Israeli soldiers in interviews that they did with the mainstream US media outlet, the Associated Press, the AP. They admitted that in Israel's colonial wars on Gaza, Israel frequently, not just a few times, but frequently, consistently, Israeli soldiers use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Because the reality is that the US empire and its Israeli outpost are so used to fighting women and children and defenseless men. They're so used to fighting small little guerrilla armies that have access to very low-level technology and not very many weapons and ammunition, because the US loves to invade relatively small countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. The US is afraid of actually fighting countries that can defend themselves. And Israel loves to invade Gaza, this tiny little strip of land where Palestinians have been living under a brutal Israeli siege, a medieval blockade, for over 15 years. Israel controls everything that goes in and out. It controls the airspace, the water, the land routes. This is why the former conservative Prime Minister of the UK, David Cameron, correctly referred to Gaza as a prison camp. Israel has turned it into the world's largest concentration camp. And the US and Israel are bullies. They love to pick on small countries and occupied people who cannot actually defend themselves. But Iran is a relatively larger country. Iran does have a pretty advanced military, and even though it's not at the same level as the US military, which supports Israel, Iran has claimed that it did damage to the Israeli military. And in fact, Iran reported that it shot down fifth-generation F-35 fighter jets that the US sold to Israel. These are, of course, US-made top-of-the-line jets. And again, I need to emphasize that Israel's military has been built up by the United States. Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US empire in one of the most strategic regions on Earth. For instance, the Biden administration gave Israel $18 billion of military assistance, including weapons, ammunition, missiles, planes. And now the Trump administration is giving billions of dollars more worth of weapons and ammunition to Israel. Israel cannot carry out any of these wars against Iran, against Gaza, against Lebanon, against Syria. It cannot carry out any of these wars without support from the US. So we here at Geopolitical Economy Report will be very closely following what is happening, and there's a very real danger of this war continuing to expand. So if you want to be informed about what's really happening and not just get a very superficial analysis like you hear in the Western corporate media, please like and subscribe. Please share this. Please follow our work. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.